Good evening, everyone. Good evening here in the studio, and good evening to our online viewers. My name is Edla Kaumbi, and I am the Executive Director of the Namibia Institute of Corporate Governance. Welcome to Fireplace Conversations. This is the second in a series for this year. We started talking about ESG because we have different themes. For July, we're talking about ESG. For June, sorry, we're talking about ESG. And last week, we started talking about the E of ESG. And tonight, we're talking about the S of ESG. So I just want to recap what happened last week for those of you. Sorry, this is not Netflix. You cannot skip the recap. So last week, we talked about the E of ESG. And just so that everyone can understand that ESG really has to do with how we do business responsibly and sustainably. And when we talk about the E of it, we're talking about how organizations can be responsible toward the environment. So whether they are recycling, how they're using energy and things like that. We got a little on a rabbit trail talking about green hydrogen, but I hope in that conversation you saw that at the end of the day is, yes, we're progressing, we're going forward, but how are we doing that? You know, are we doing it in a way that's responsible, minding all the stakeholders? So this evening, I'm joined by Tuna Willem, and I'm joined by Mr. Vetumbwavi Mungunda, and we're going to talk about the S of ESG. And so we also just want to thank our sponsor, Alan Gray, for making this possible, and our media partner, the Namibian newspaper. So let's get into it. Maybe introduce yourself, Tuna Willem, just your background and education and all of that.
Okay. My name is Tuna Willem. I initially studied TV and video production. I came into the space through my work in corporate, working in communications, and eventually found my way into stakeholder engagement and design of projects with social impact, etc., etc. I now work in the space of social enterprise, where we specifically design projects that have a coalition or an intersect between social and economic, and we specifically look at the spaces of either charitable, social enterprise, capital or development projects, specifically working with private sector funding, and largely with communities and certain government institutions. Yeah.
Thank you. Sounds exciting. Mr. Mungunda, can you tell us a bit about you?
No, thanks. My name is Vetumbwavi Mungunda. My background is actually coming from probably the more formal corporate business, in that I studied accounting and finance. I worked at Deloitte. I was at Deloitte for many years. And then I was the chief executive of Standard Bank for 7 years. And then in the last 2 years, have left the formal corporate world, but not entirely, because I still serve on a number of boards on some of the more larger listed companies in Namibia. But at the same time, I'm also now working almost like at the intersection of trying to integrate informal economic activities with a formal economy, but also trying to almost bring a stronger emphasis on the S in the ESG in terms of in terms of social impact.
Yeah. Okay. Well, welcome. And so let's just get into it. Maybe explain what is the S in ESG and what does it represent, especially within the Namibian context.
Sure.
Yeah. Do you want to start?
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Look, I think traditionally when we're talking about... Sorry, I speak quite softly, so please, if I'm speaking softly, put your hand up. But initially, if we look at the traditional definition of the S in ESG, we're talking about labor relations, diversity, inclusivity of employees mostly. But if you look at the landscape of the S, essentially, of the corporation as an entity in the landscape, and you look at the stakeholders that it intersects with, you're essentially looking at the shareholders, you're looking at the business itself, you're looking at employees, you're looking at the community, and you actually should also be looking at the government. So I find that the S can be broadened, and it can be made a little bit more relevant to our landscape in Namibia, and we can articulate it more, more structurally by adopting it and making it relevant to ourselves.
So when you're talking about it, like speak about it for people who don't know. So what do we mean when we say, you said inclusivity, and what do we mean? Like what is the expectation that we're having of organizations when we say S? What are we saying? Like what about those things?
Yeah. Look, I think if you're asking me, I would say that we need to explain it this way. There's the academic and then there are the technical explanations of what it means by incorporating the social component. But then there's the more human-centered approach when we say, what does the social mean? What does it mean in the Namibian landscape? And how can it be articulated in the private sector space? And I think that if you have to maybe explain it to an 11-year-old, let's maybe explain it to an 11-year-old, we need to talk about how can we be kind to each other? How can we understand where the other person is coming from? And this actually speaks to employees. It speaks to, the community member, the beneficiary. How can we, be more inclusive in how we design the projects that impact people? How can we create processes, projects, and systems that can be inclusive for entrepreneurs, for employees? How can employees feel more a part of the organization? So, and I think when we're talking about the S in the ESG, I would look at it like that. Obviously, each organization can also become more unique in terms of where their challenges in the S space, and then they can adjust those metrics to be more specific. And I think also just to strengthen what we would call their social license to trade. So I would explain it maybe in very layman's terms like that. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So where does corporate social responsibility fit in? How are companies approaching this corporate social responsibility? Does it have anything to do with what she said? And how do we ensure that it's not a tick box exercise?
Now, maybe before I get there, I just want to maybe add to the understanding of the S within the ESG. Right. So I will actually kind of call it just like basic human values of equity, fairness, transparency, inclusiveness, but also, and that's obviously when an organization kind of look internally. Yes. Are we really intentional in terms of being inclusive? Are we intentional in terms of being fair? But also, I think you spoke about also the external interactions with society as well, and there I will probably use the almost like the UN SDG goals, kind of to also define that, and I will kind of pick some of the SDG goals that are more related to the S, and that's also quite, I think, as an organization, as corporates, and as citizens. How do we understand matters relating to no poverty, zero hunger, good health, quality education within our society and within the environment in which we operate? Mm-hmm. And I think, and the key there is that as corporate citizens, as organizations, is to really understand how, and you would have probably seen the newspaper headlines today, people dying of hunger, malnutrition, kids, Maheke and some other regions. So it is really, I think, as corporate citizens, is for us to make sure that we understand those issues, those challenges, and we worked to interact with those issues and challenges. Now, I think when you kind of look at your question around the CSI, and I think what I have seen some organizations do around that is they actually take CSI as charity. And it is almost like doing someone a favor, and it's donations, it is piecemeal, a small donation here in that region, another one in another region, and as a result, there's actually no momentum, there's no impact, there's actually not going to be change. You go 3 years later, you come back, you need to give the same donation to the same school or to the same community, because it is not coordinated, it's not thematic, it is not an integrated solution. Yeah, so I think that's probably the challenge, I think, when we approach CSI more as charities, actually doing someone a favor, as opposed to actually being an obligation and a responsibility as a corporate citizen.
How do you do that then? What should that look like then practically?
So I think, and you will see some examples in this, where an organization actually take a strategic, integrate this question as part of its strategic, intent. And when you do that, you actually start to engage with these issues, and you also become, in order to have impact, you need to also focus. You can't be dealing with everything. So you will need to say, maybe for our organization, we want to deal with this or that. And then really allocate resources, but not only resources in terms of money, but resources in terms of systems, in terms of processes, in terms of structures, but also in terms of real strategic partnerships with other organizations and also with communities as well, and really try to put up something that is sustainable.
I just want to add to that point, if I can.
Yeah.
Because, when I was going through the questions and just trying to see, how we're going to take this forward, one of the key things I think that really, having been in corporate for so long and also having run various CSI and sustainability portfolios, one of the biggest challenges that you find in dispensing this, I fully agree, integration, I fully agree in collaboration, but you'll find the actual resource that is supposed to dispense that function is a CSI manager or a CSI practitioner who is supposed to sit in meetings, who's supposed to take minutes, who's supposed to speak to communities, who's supposed to, etc., etc. So going back to one of the points that Vetu mentioned is actually, before we can even actually start dispensing this function as it should be, start analyzing it, start designing it, we need to look at how this function is structured within our organizations and how to capacitate it, and then how that function can also be educated about the external environment. Because that function is supposed to, and I say it maybe from a place because I had to do that. I had to report to a board, I had to deal with shareholders, I had to deal with communities, regions, governors, and the whole landscape. But you have very little support. So you'll find that, there are passionate practitioners, passionate CFOs, passionate CEOs, and passionate boards. But the structures need to mature more to assist and support these guys to be able to understand how to communicate with communities in, the government space or at community level. So there's a lot of challenges before we can even get to this utopia that we're speaking about. And then second to that is if we could look at integrating it, because a lot of corporates, the lesser money we know, the budgets, and maybe the ex-CEO of a bank can correct me, but I think just standard practice that a lot of the budget, operational implementation budget for CSI is generally ring-fenced into the project budget, when there should actually be a budget just for operations to run that function. So I just wanted to maybe articulate on some of those points because that compromises a lot of quality work. Then just the last point is collaboration. You'll find I am doing what I'm doing as Innovate, but I'm doing it on my own because for whatever reason, I have designed it to be. But it would serve us much better if we had some sort of baseline, some sort of database, some sort of house to function from, some sort of process or policy that we can actually start doing what Vetu was also saying, but be able to build cumulative value in what we're calling CSI or CSR, and then also have what is grant, what problems can we enterprise around, and what problems can corporate also come in on. So I think the landscape is broader, but I think the mechanism starting from just how to dispense it, how to design it is slightly compromised as well.
When we're discussing this, and talking about corporate social responsibility, it sounds as if, it's what we do with our profits or our money to help those who are not part of our organization. But what does that look like for the people who actually work for you? Does that apply as well in terms of the S of ESG, or does that not fall within that scope of that?
You mean the people that work for the organization?
The organization?
Yeah, so what I have seen is, and this is really the point, is that when you make it actually a part of your strategic thinking process, you need to actually go through a process to say, what is it that as an organization we're going to focus on? And you need to, as you will do with your strategic planning, involve your staff, you involve your stakeholders in saying that what are the social and challenges out there, and which one as an organization do we want to tackle, but actually tackle in a meaningful manner. So that then once you actually get into implementation, involving employees actually makes them to not only feel to be a solution to the challenges, but they actually start to, and I have seen that where they really start to feel a stronger connection to the society out there and the challenges in the societies out there.
Okay.
Part of the things that for example, I would do was to take our staff from wherever they live and whatever. And if we're talking about housing, we will actually get them into the Havanas, the Babylons, and for them to, because some of the staff members, I tell them that you are privileged. You would have gone to school, you've got a job, but you've never been to a place where the real social challenges are actually being experienced on a daily basis. And when you start to actually make people to see and feel these things, they actually feel almost like a need for them not to actually be involved and to actually become a solution to the challenges out there.
So what I'm also referring to is, they say charity begins at home. So in terms of how we look after our staff, not them dispensing charity, in other words, does ESG also apply to the diversity and inclusion in terms of the people that are employed by you? Is that a thing? Yeah. So what are some of those things that are essential? Like, what are the companies that are doing it well? What does that look like?
Look, I think if you look at it, they say that companies report profits, but people are the ones that are delivering those profits. And in many instances, I can only speak, when I was in corporate, there were a lot of ideas that flew around on how to better, the position of the employee for various reasons. If it could be for retention, it could be for development. But a lot of those ideas would certainly fall through because they didn't speak to where the employee was at. But the ideas that really stuck through was where the ideas and solutions were co-designed with employees. Because at the end of the day, it's where, let me just say we as an employee of my own small organization, you have your concerns, you have your challenges, and especially when we went through, COVID and economic crises and households were under pressure. These are people that run families and households and their social challenges and social problems. I think it was important for those social considerations to be considered, not just performance-related issues, and you co-design it because you need each other. We're not asking, again, with the conversation of, building these, the structure for social enterprise or for social projects or for CSI. We're not saying the business must sway itself from its fundamental objectives, which are commercially driven. But if there can be that integrated co-design, to sit down with the employees and say, how we say, Owens and Owa, what are we supposed to do? Because that's how we're supposed to be talking to each other, but we're talking past each other a lot and not hearing the pains, and we're looking at quantitative aspects also, and instead of also the qualitative aspects. And I think if we can start doing that, we'll also start really touching on the social issues of employees. Truly, you give them a daily home for 8 hours or 9 hours a day, and they can also bring something to the table because a lot of their concerns and challenges are understood and some are taken care of. Yeah.
If I may add,
sure.
that question will always arise.
Correct.
But I think the key thing is where one really gets the conversation to where we're doing this because our communities and our societies really need it. But if there are certain sections within our own organization that need that as well, then they will also qualify. But and I have seen that where people will say, but you're saying that, and we actually went through a process where we say, if we're doing this for a community out there, these are the criteria. And if there are people within our organization that actually meet those criteria, let's also include them. But I think the key part is that we need to get our people, our organizations, and our systems to understand that when you do something good, you're doing it for the good of others, not necessarily for you to get something in return.
Yeah, that's good. You spoke earlier when we were talking about, I think when we were talking about CSR, so we talked about impact, and you said how it's not good, people look at it as charity and they go and give things, but they don't see the impact. So how do we do that better? What are the metrics that we can use, or how can we measure impact? And I know, especially because ESG has to do with investing and how, organizations that are investing they want to see these results. They want to see the measurements. They want to see how, what did you do? Show us, your.
Yeah. No, if I may start, I think I just want to maybe comment on, so what are the social contexts within which we as a society actually operate? And if you're doing something that, and obviously we can add to that, but if you're doing something that doesn't address those social contexts. You are handing money, you're doing projects, but if they are not dealing with the social challenges and the context that in which we operate. So we have highest unemployment. So if you're giving money, is that going to create employment? We have the second highest inequality. We have poverty as quite high for especially our level of income as a country. So which means that obviously it confirms the challenge with inequality is that although our average income as a country is quite high, we still have high level of underdevelopment. We have hunger, so these are some of the issues that we're dealing with as a country. Now, so the questions of what is it that we do as an organization, and is obviously we're dealing with housing, one can add. And so are those things that we are dealing with and that we are handing out, is that going to increase employment? Is it going to help with inequality? Is it going to help with the housing crisis? And I think this is actually the lenses that through which we need to look at our initiatives and our CSI activities. Yeah. And the second part of, I think as I said earlier, is that when the CSI is not CSI, I wouldn't, if our activities are not integrated into the strategic thinking that happens at an organization, it becomes a side project. And when it is a side project, it is not coordinated. And when it is not coordinated, it will be a number of activities that are happening individually that will not, you might have a big budget that you're spending, but because you're doing separate small projects, they are not going to actually make an impact, firstly. Secondly, I think as a country as well, and you look at our spend on social grants, pensions, and whatever. So we're spending quite a lot more money handing out food instead of actually creating systems that are more sustainable. And that is both from a public sector and also from a private sector perspective. And it's also the social sector as well, NGOs. So there's quite a lot of handouts that are happening instead of actually collaborating to say, how do we create social enterprises that deal with impact but are also still more sustainable? How do we create collaborative public-private social partnerships that actually create enterprises that deal with the social challenges that we are actually having?
You want to add something to that? Yeah, sure.
I think a key point in the beginning of what you spoke about is, Vetu, is data-driven impact, data-driven initiatives. And that's probably something that we really, really lack. So when we talk about governance, I think that sometimes when we talk about this S in the ESG, we also forget that the S itself requires governance. So now we are spending all of this money, and let's say tomorrow we are asked, you spend all of this money in all of these sectors, how do you account for that spend? What was the decisions that you made for that spend versus the disparities that we have in our society? So there is a mismatch. There is somewhat of a mismatch, and because of that mismatch, we're not able to be very effective in our programs. We collectively, we've not made a decision with the spend that's happening, through pension funds, that's happening through unlisted fund managers, that's happening through CSI programs, social enterprise. We've not made a collective decision to say, look, what is the wheel? What are the elements in that wheel, and how can we, if we tackle, for example, food production, what will be the outcome of that in 10, 20 years? So we also, just because we're calling it CSI or CSR, there's a huge oversight in putting commercial metrics to it and saying we're investing X amount. For that X amount we're investing in these sectors, in these people, in these individuals, what is the outcome that we're looking at? So there needs to be some re-engineering driven by data, driven by insights, and also driven by collaborations, and also actually integrating it into our corporations. You'll find countries like India, Australia, actually have what you would call a national CSR charter, they have chambers, and there's a coordination of data that makes it easier for private sector also. So private sector is not necessarily supposed to act as a development agency, but it's supposed to act as an aid, as a partner, for the economy or for the environment that they're doing business in. So there's just something that needs a strong sense of oversight, and that is a data-driven environment. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Oh, we need to speak up. They can't hear us. Oh my goodness, you're suffering in silence. Sorry. Sure. Right. I don't know. Okay. Hopefully we'll, because that's what I wanted to get to in terms of how do we measure impact and because in the environmental space they have the matrices and they have like standards and stuff. So do we have that at all in terms of, is social measured? Are there some existing standards already for it, or do we?
Look, we did an exercise where can you hear me? Or should I face this way? So we did an exercise where we engaged some government officers and asked, if private sector invests or if these projects are supported, what are the incentives? What is the return? What is the support for these initiatives? Hoping to find any bit of information that would also speak to what you're saying. And what I found is that government in individual areas says this is what we're doing to support this area. Besides now, the spend that government undertakes, but there's also efforts that government is undertaking to support. But the coordination of that and the targeting of that and the creation of the space that we're talking about is just not there. Not only from government side, but also from our side.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
If I may add to that, I think
they can hear him better.
Yeah. I've got a view that the S part of the ESG is actually the neglected child in many ways. So firstly, I think if you look at the E, so E, obviously from a West perspective, the Western world, climate is obviously quite a big issue in terms of emissions and all of that. So there's quite a huge undertaking that has taken place in terms of having standards, but also putting funding behind that as well. And if you look at the governance, we have had, probably now we are on the fourth kind of guidance on governance. But if you look at the S, I think the S mostly, the issues around S in particular in terms of inequality, poverty, are more in the South. And as a result, I think the South have not probably been as proactive in kind of driving quite a lot of, first of all, yeah. So yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I was
not Karas, but
no. I mean.
Yeah.
Okay. So the challenge as well in terms of the S as well is that those social challenges will also be different between different countries as well. So I think as a country we need to have taken a much stronger proactive stance in terms of what are the issues for us from a S perspective. Yeah. How do we measure them? What initiatives should we be implementing to drive the change in those matters? And also, what are the incentives and penalties that needs to be instituted in order to be able to get the outcomes that you need?
Yes.
So we haven't had that as a country, and I think as a world as well. So if you look at the G from a governance perspective, those guidelines are adopted by the stock exchanges. So there is penalty if you don't abide by those guidelines. But if you look at the S, one will probably find some of those measures in some of the regulations and legislations that have been spoken about for the last 20 years in terms of localization and all of that, but they have never come through. And as a result, whether a company does A or not, it actually doesn't really matter. So I think, on the S side, I think in terms of the incentives, so maybe just on that, for example, in other countries, what they do, for example, they will say, if a company operates in a rural area, they will have a tax rebate compared to where they are actually set up in a town. What does that do? It's trying to kind of get companies to go out into the rural areas. If you look at certain sectors that are prone to create more employment, for example, then you say companies that are in that sector, the tax rate is a little bit lower than companies in sectors that don't actually create employment. So you need to look at the metrics that you want to measure that are important in your context, and then you need to put in the measures that actually will be able to drive the behavior that you want. And we haven't actually been able to, I think, get that right as a country, but also as a world as well.
I feel like I want to maybe open it up. You in the audience couldn't hear us well. Are there any questions, any comments, anything that you maybe want us to recap? There's a roaming mic, and I don't know if online, or people who are doing online, are there questions or comments?
I asked a question whether this mic actually works. I have to say something.
No, you don't have to. Please do.
No, I do. My name is Ravonia. I'm the Group Corporate Social Investment Manager for First Rent Namibia. And my challenge is always the sustainability part versus social challenges, offering solutions for the communities, which is so difficult. So yes, a portion of the budget still does go to challenges or the problems or the projects where you can't really, they just unable to get at a point where they sustain themselves. Also considering poverty and hunger. If we look at the drought at the moment, farmers need help. Them gardens, else we can farmers could out. So I think as a country, crisis that we're facing it, this immediate support that you have to give the farmers and poverty. Our community have read several times about the issues in Omaheke where the little children are starving. Projects are implemented. We recently also joined an organization who is assisting the communities there. They do give some supplements at the hospital, but once the child goes home with this package, the whole family lives from this. And the child ends up in hospital again. So looking at how can we equip this community for them to become self-sustainable in the long run. So yes, I've always had, because I have a heart for CSI, and I understand, and Steve has several times, even in our boardrooms, mentioned the sustainable part, but it's so difficult in the challenging economic times.
I want to use the microphone because the online people can't hear you. Sorry.
Is it on? Okay, good. Because the challenging part is, okay, I made a comment. I said this economy has become, the crisis has become personal, even for us who are working. So what about those many unemployed Namibians out there? But thank you for your contributions. I made a few notes, and I'm going to consider and then look at how best we can still invest in the communities in which we operate.
It sounds like, wouldn't it be helpful to have mentorship programs or to insist on, to sort of help people, sort of like what they do with entrepreneurs when they train them, and then they also do mentorships to, I don't know, maybe help with the sustainability, or would that not work? But anyway, you want to say something?
I'm going to make this comment not as a statement or something that should be done, or that I have architected it. It came to my mind now because you're not the only one that deals with that challenge. Many people in the space deal with that challenge. You'll find, donor agencies coming to this country with impact funds or grant funding, and you come to the environment and you ask, where is the need, how can we assist? The first challenge that hits you is that the data, the information is not available. The turnaround time is months to get to action. So you start, a lot of that funding that is engineered for projects, 70% of it is now spent into maturing the landscape before you can actually invest in the project itself. And now that I've seen is not necessarily because we don't we don't want the investment, we're not in need, we're not in immediate hunger. But I think if we just take a step back, maybe 10 steps back, and put these problems on the wall, on sticky notes, and we ask ourselves and say, but why do we keep experiencing the same problems and the same challenges over and over again? How many practitioners, how many development agencies, how many international organizations and countries and entities are in this country all trying to do the same thing? And why are we not making, or why are we not getting the traction? Why do we keep experiencing drought the way we do every year? Why do children suffer from malnutrition in this country on a day-to-day basis? But, a few things maybe to my mind is, yes, we're about 30 years old as a country, but this S that we have in the ESG is a very immature S in many senses, because it's not structured, there's no infrastructure for it, there's not a coordinated environment, it's not policied, there's a lot of atrophy in this space. So you find a lot of time and aid and energy spent, but it sinks into a black hole. If you have to say, where's a data report, where's a report that we can look at that says, First Rand has done this, Bank Windhoek, who's doing what, and what are we putting this money into? And when are we actually going to say, but actually guys, let's take a step back, maybe this is not working. If we were, all of us here, to be made CEOs of that S, all of us would probably collectively be fired, because we can't account for where the spend is going. So as an executive, if I'm sitting in corporate and my board members asked me and said, well, come up with a plan. How would you ensure that this money or these resources or in-kind or technical partnerships that are coming into this country for this space are accounted for? I think that is what we should be speaking about. Once we've spoken about a strategic plan or an organized approach, policy environment, infrastructure, framework, then we can start talking about these low-hanging fruits, mentorship and whatnot, because that would be a natural outcome and a tactical program, an outcome of a strategic plan. So just quickly, in short, I think that the S needs strategic intervention. That's what I think. Before, and I'm not saying we must stop so we can plan to death, but I'm just saying while we are trying to mitigate and fill the holes, we need a plan, we need a direction, we need a structure, we need a house. I'm not saying I'm 100% correct, but that is, if I was tasked to show up tomorrow to do that, that is one of the things I would propose, because it's not working.
Yeah. Okay.
I will actually respond to say that people are not going hungry because there's no food.
Exactly.
That's a symptom.
Exactly.
And I think as a society is, what is actually the root cause? The root cause is that we don't have productive systems that produce food. We don't have employment. And I think when we look at the solution, I think as a society, both private sector, public, social sectors, we need to actually come together, because also when we do things individually, as I said earlier, you can't have enough to do everything for the country. But when we pull resources together, when we create partnerships, when we create collaborations, and then also target on what are the 3-4 most important things for the country, and how do we direct resources there, both in terms of grants, in terms of CSR spend, but also how do we crowdfunding into those areas that is more, normal private capital. Those are the things I think that will actually solve these issues once and for all. But if we kind of throwing money at the root causes, which is people are hungry, we give them food, we are just going to continue with that cycle.
Exactly. How do countries like China, they set up, how long are their economic development plans for their strategies that they set up? How long? Maybe they plan for 10, 20, 30 years. And we should be looking at the same thing and saying, how do we mechanize agriculture? How do we mechanize, and having different collaboration vehicles, tackling it in parallel, bringing in the incentives so that we can, for once and for all, stop having conversations about who's hungry, going for a check handover. And there's nothing wrong with that, because it's a mechanism. But if you look at, if you run an analysis, we do provide analysis for some foundations. If you run an analysis on the impact of that foundation, you'll find that you can clarify, you can actually what is the word? You can conclude that it's actually a charitable initiative. And so if it's just charitable, that corporate is dispensing a charitable initiative, it means that there's high social value and low business value. When in essence, these initiatives and collaborations should have high social value and high business value, which then speaks to the sustainability of the affair. So there is a lot of work to be done. We're not saying that, oh, it's doomsday, etc., but we need to tighten the coordination and start looking at these different sectors.
Yeah. Exciting. I love it. Yes. So I want to maybe look a little bit forward. Yeah, give me 1 second. Just ask. Everybody all right in there, or are they? Oh, there's a comment here from Naita, or comment or question. Oh, okay. The audience is very busy here. I like it. Miss Naita here in the pink scarf. Yes. What's happening?
All right.
Oh.
All right. Thank you so much. My name is Irish Goro, and I'm with the United Nations Development Program, and I work particularly on a portfolio that focuses on sustainable, inclusive green growth. So part of our work is to make sure that we have an enabling environment to allow for impact investment to happen, right? So I have been listening to the conversation, and there's a lot that is coming out, especially listening to Tuna. I wanted to find out from both of you, or even from the room, if there is such a response, whether you feel that, or you think that the way our frameworks are set up in terms of business registration allow for social enterprises to actually thrive, or is it that you are either set up as an NGO, which is not necessarily meant to be profitable, you know, on the books, or you are set up as a PTY or a CC, which is more profit focused, you know, but there isn't that setup way or a framework that allows for enterprises to actually be of social good, but at the same time be in a space where they are profitable. So that's a question I have. Do you feel like the frameworks that we currently have, or how you currently set up as entities, actually allows you to be able to do this type of work and remain profitable at the same time delivering social impact? Yeah.
Should we maybe, I don't know, because I want to ask, where have you seen it? Are there examples of where what you're asking is done? And yeah.
Vehicle.
Give her the mic again. I think the
Yeah.
yeah.
Once the private sector allocates resources that eventually speak to their interventions that are more social, a lot of them end up going the CSR route, right? Which
Right.
is not necessarily you're just giving but ideally you're supposed to be able to, you know, take ownership and actually it's supposed to be aligned to some extent to your corporate strategy, you know, so that at least you can report it on your books and you are incentivized as such for doing such work, right? So I would propose that such a framework be set up if it isn't there, but I would also like to find out how are you navigating that space to make sure that your contribution is acknowledged and your contribution is actually making the relevant impact that it's supposed to make. Yeah.
So then, before we go to...
Yeah, so I'm just maybe going to add to that. I think that's actually a very good point, but what it actually then requires is for the players to come together from across the spectrum in terms of the public sector, which are regulators, legislators. Then you have got the private sector, you've got the social sectors, NGOs, DFIs, and all of that. They need to come together, create a forum, and it actually happening in other countries. They create a forum where they will have this type of conversations in terms of, first of all, in Namibia, the S, what are the most pressing issues around the S? And then how do we kind of enliven that? How do we put more energy and fire into that? What are the incentives that are required? How do we crowd capital into those? How do we provide incentives? What are the inhibitors that needs to be? So, for example, if, for example, the absence of a social enterprise framework is an inhibitor, so then you have those engagements, you compare notes. So I think globally these things are happening. There's an organization called Global Steering Group for Impact Investing, and it has local affiliations in a number of countries. Actually, in Namibia, we're in the process of, with the help of the UNDP as well, to try and see how do we navigate that. As an example, I visited that forum in the UK. It's called Impact Investing Institute. Now they kind of bring, they call it the city, which is obviously the stock exchange and all the capitalists, with the social sectors, with government, and they have these conversations. And one of the initiatives, for example, for them is to say, all the unclaimed funds in the banking sector, in the insurance sector, should not be returned to income, should actually be allocated to create a crowding mechanism for impact investing, as an example. But this can only happen if people come together and they create a forum to have this type of conversations.
Thank you. Naita, you wanted to ask a question?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you for thought-provoking discussions. What I wanted to say, the S for me is also the sustainability. And sustainability is also having agency. And Namibia is 34 years old or young. And up to now, we have an education system that doesn't produce people for the labor market or for production. And from the latest census, we know that about 70% of Namibians are between the age of 15 to 35 years young. And when we look at our education system, we don't have the dual education system, or a system that produces employers, that produces people relevant for our job market. So when we look at the S and when we look at sustainability, are we looking at a country, are we working private sector with policymakers, with the legislature, to look at how do we look at our education system to produce now people that have agency, that are sustainable, that can create employment? Or will we continue with the education system as is, and we are creating academics and technocrats and people who can talk well, who can speak English, but they're not employing people? Because what's very important, if we want to be sustainable, we need to have agency. And at the moment, we don't have agency. That's why we have so many other agents and consultants and institutions that come and give us the money, but we are not creating it from bottom up in our education system. So what is the discussion there with policymakers and private sector?
Yeah, Gina wants to answer that.
Please, I want.
Oh, do you want the gentleman at the back wants to ask, and then maybe Tuna, you can answer that. You're not gonna forget. Oh my goodness, sir, I'm so sorry. Yes, this gentleman has been having his hand up, but you can go ahead and then we can give to him, since it's
Sure.
gonna be logistically weird.
I'm Donnie Botha. I just want to know from everybody, 34 years after we became free to do what we want, we are sitting and having a conversation like this, saying we should come together. It's kind of mind-boggling that we will sit here and say we should have all these players come together. My question is, why are we not doing it? What has been inhibiting us? And if we can find what is the reason why we have not done it, maybe we can then solve the problem and start doing it. Because, and I'm wondering, even the contradiction of, we had a liberation movement aligned to socialist ideals, yeah? Aligned to an agenda of improving things for the poor. What has happened? And I think we need to become very radical in analyzing what happened historically with government. What are the ideals that they are pursuing? Business exists for profit. Government is supposed to balance that with a social agenda. So what has really happened here, and what do we do to fix it? I think that is really my question. And it cannot be such a complicated thing. And what is happening now, if we get all the players together, government, private sector, and the NGO sector, problem is none of them really are the voice of the people down there who are starving and suffering. And it seems that government is making it more and more difficult for initiatives from the grassroots to arise, because the Financial Intelligence Act and so on make it more and more difficult for registration to function, to be able to function in that space. So that's why, as you say, we don't have agency. Our agency is even taken away from us, and the agents are coming to do it for us. So we need to solve that problem.
Thank you, Mr. Botha. Gina, do you want to speak while we get the mic to the gentleman in front?
I would like to really, because I think that question, the question that, should I? Can I speak up? Questions? Yeah. Should I use a mic? Is that better?
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Oh, he's saying no. Okay, let me try and speak up. Questions like that excite me because sometimes we get caught up in talking about what we should be doing instead of asking ourselves why we are not doing what we should be doing, and why are we doing it the way that we are doing it and still getting the results that we are getting. So that question actually answers Naita's question about agency. We keep asking about agency, but each of us here, this country, we're sovereign beings. We're a sovereign country, I suppose, according to the ideals of independence and the constitution that is, this beautiful constitution that we have. But I think instinctively and individually as Namibians, and maybe because we're only 34 years young, but even by virtue of that age, Naita, I just don't think that we as individuals are asking us, are we doing what we're supposed to be doing? Are we taking up the positions of leadership? If something is not being done, are we looking at the EU? Are we looking at FNB? Are we looking at we're not even talking about foreign entities. Are we looking at organizations, at fixing our communities? Or are we looking at ourselves as individuals to say, what role can I play as Tuna in my little small business that is making $2,000 a year? And when we start having those questions and asking ourselves those questions, why are we not doing it independently? Why are we not standing up and doing that? It's a question of leadership. But what is leadership? What is accountability? What is ownership? I think as we are all raised in our various households, irrespective of whatever challenges we have gone through, somewhere along the way, we have lost the individual ability to take responsibility. And then we have lost the individual ability to challenge each other and say, but why is this happening? And we're just putting that onus on corporations. We're putting that onus on conversations. I'm not saying that the individual is the one that is going to solve everything. But around the world, when things have really changed in countries, in organizations, is individuals that have stood up and said, actually, we're not doing this thing the right way. I'm going to try and do it instead of waiting. And then you go for it and you bring the rest along. I know that we have capable and competent leaders sitting in this room who are sitting and working in various instances, in various organizations. What if private sector never gets up and says and does what we've been talking about? What if government just is going to remain the way that it is? Not because that they're necessarily doing something wrong, but they're completely inundated with what it is that they need to be, what they're trying to do. So what are we as individuals and citizens and residents of this country going to do, and the leadership that we need to take as individuals to actually bring about a change, to actually bring about and say, I will do this, I will coordinate this. When did we lose that agency? Because that's the agency I believe is the agency we need to start considering to bring to the table. I don't think we need to wait for people to bring our voice to the table. Why can't we put our voice on the table? Why can't we speak up? We don't have to burn the walls of the country down. But why can't we have conversations like we're having now and saying, Honorable Minister, I'm going to come and sit outside your office for the next 3 years until you can help me understand why 5-year-olds are being raped in my community. And there's nothing being done through the justice system. I'm making an example, but it is very recent cases that we're going through. So before I think we ask about agency and all these highfalutin concepts of governance, what are we doing?
Can I maybe just, I think I'm going to be very short on that. So I think the first thing is that I think that when Tuna was talking about data, so when we look at unemployment, we need to understand what is it that we're solving for. The people that are unemployed in the highest numbers are actually people without formal qualifications. These are people, I think about 70–80% of the people that are unemployed today do not have junior secondary schooling. So when we look at what is it that we're solving, when you look at the data, so this is not a question of that we've got skilled people that are not being employed. Actually, the majority are actually unqualified people. The second part, I think, around, why has there been no change? My view is that these things actually happen because someone take a decision to do something about it. And that can be anyone, and we shouldn't be blaming people in government, in the private sectors individually. And what I have seen is that also organization can actually take a decision that changes an industry and it changes the country. And I go back to my time at Deloitte. When we were qualifying, we were early on in our days. Almost all the chartered accountants used to be imported from South Africa. Deloitte started a process to intentionally create skills and people. And that really changed that sector to where it is actually self-standing. It was not funded by a government. It was not funded by anyone. It actually started with an institution, and it kind of started to mushroom into the whole industry. But these are things that each one of us, so I wouldn't actually, my good friend Danny, I wouldn't ask why has nothing been done. I will say we are where we are. What is it that each of us individually going to do to change the course that we are actually on now? I think some of us are actually taking it as a personal obligation and challenge. And I'm just hoping that everyone will do that.
Sorry.
Thank you. Panel, thank you so much for those contributions. My name is Joshua Mario. My point, I had 2 points. The other one was already exhausted, but let me just touch a bit on it. I think the challenge that Mr. Vinbai actually mentioned, why the S is silent. The E we can see, the G we can see, but that I think the issue of profit. To what extent do I let go of my profit? Key number one. I think we also need to really educate more on issues of profit, because really, when you really want to make profit, you want to make profit, and you are really on it. I think that's where the S has been missing in action. Secondly, I think the understanding of the social aspect. Whenever the issue of social aspect comes to mind, we think of charity, we think of free, we think of it will drain me. You think of, so I think that mindset should be challenged a bit to see, okay, when you talk about the social aspect, to what extent do you still invade the space of social, but still being profitable and still keeping to your purpose? I think when that education comes to the mind of corporate, of leaders, and I think they're able to marry the two and say, no, you are not an enemy, you're actually a friend who can also actually help us to sustain and keep ourselves in check. Lastly, I think it boils down to the willingness, just like what you're saying. What is your individual contribution? I think the willingness also for the corporate to go that extent. Namibia, please, I'm speaking under correction. I think around about between 60 to 70 or 75% are actually international companies. Now, where do we start convincing them to be able to actually now look at the aspect of social? To what extent do we convince them to actually look into this aspect? For example, there are some companies I'll not mention for the sake of it. They do a lot of this aspect in their countries, but they are extended to us, and we don't see any in terms of even scholarships, in terms of empowering the community. We don't see it, but they've got branches in our country, and they're actually operating in our territory. So I think regulators, legislature, if they can come together and also help us in this area, I think the S will start emerging and start, finding its limbs and grow again, in short.
So can I maybe just, I think, before I forget, I think the point around almost like this CSI and charity and doing good. for me, it's not actually, financial sustainability and doing good is not mutually exclusive. It's actually more complementary. Organizations that do good enhances their brand, enhances their acceptability, and they actually become more sustainable and grow better. It's actually a question of doing good in a manner that actually makes an impact in society so that that brand is enhanced. If you're doing a lot of small things, spending a lot of money, but the impact is not seen, obviously the brand doesn't get that value, and as a result, it doesn't translate into increased financial sustainability. So the key is, and I have seen it wherever, is that whenever an organization does well, does good in communities and does good, it actually grows much stronger than those that are not doing good. And I think that's something that we really need to accept. And I think on your last point, the point of, one can use an example of an entity that buys from foreign companies or from outside the country. What you are doing then is that the community and enterprises that could have been developed in the country, that could have created employment, will not be there. And that's why, these aspects around enterprise development, it is actually an imperative in terms of the social impact and growth. But it also requires a bit of regulation and also a bit of incentives for those that are doing good. Penalties for those that are not, and then incentive for those that are doing good. And I think what we have seen, from a regulatory perspective, our government has been quite slow around clarifying what is good and when is good incentivized and how is it incentivized.
Yeah, I also want to just add to that. There's a comment from our online community as well, Ms. Bernadette Hiliquete. She said, if we do not invest in the community that we do business, how do we expect the very community to do business with those companies? Yeah, so that's a good comment as well. So we need to start to be wrapping up. So maybe if you want to sum up, each of you can, just sum up the E of ESG and just what do we want to exhort the nation and the organizations with as we just wrap this up. We find in the audience. Let me give Fanny next. She hasn't spoken. Miss, 1 minute. Yeah, so just your final parting thoughts.
Good evening. I'm Fanny from the... Okay. It's Fanny from the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Namibia. So I've been listening very closely. I think all your comments very valuable from the audience and from the panelists. Thank you very much. I really just want to emphasize on, I think, the comment that was, and rightfully so, made by the gentleman at the back in terms of what are we doing, what is the government doing. And I know at this point we're talking about corporate social responsibility, but we tend to forget that it starts individually. Yeah, that's what he was saying. And that's the element of I know there's a key word that is out there that talks about corporate citizenship, etc. But there's also individual citizenship. And if you actually do a lot of research, the S is neglected almost everywhere in the world. And the countries that are quite strong in having the S strongly advocated for is because they have really embraced the concept of individual citizenship. That the problem is not with you don't blame the corporates, you don't blame the government. It starts with yourself, and you need to look at that element. Also, maybe to his point there is why is the S not being embraced as it should be? And compared to the E and compared to the G, I think if you really look at it from a world perspective, it is less regulated. Yeah. So yes, from a United Nations point of view, we've got the 17 UN goals, etc. But it is the less regulated aspect of the ESG, which makes it even so much harder. And also because of obviously the bottom line. How does it impact the bottom line? And because it takes so long for the social impact to be measured. If you really invest in social measures, you think, okay, how will we measure this? maybe through testimonies, maybe through photos, etc. But how does it relate back to the annual report? How does it relate back to my numbers? And people don't have the patience for that. They want immediate impact. And if we can just change our mindset to really just be patient enough to be able to measure that over a long term, I think we can really do better.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. We need to be wrapping up. How many minutes do we have? Yeah, Ravanya, you can make it
30 seconds. Just one final point that I wanted to make is when we look at the S in a corporate, I strongly believe that we shouldn't just focus on the corporate social investment part of it, because as a business, the S is evident throughout, whether it's solutions for SMEs, the Harambeans Lab, low-cost housing, not just shack dwellers, but other products that we offer through our home loans department, renewable energy, green hydrogen, and the rest. So it's not just the social investment part of it, but the impact that we make as a business that finally contributes to improving the lives of the citizens in which we operate.
Thank you. Okay, ladies and gentlemen in my studio here, your parting thoughts, and just, to summarize, your like something you want to leave the audiences and our organizations especially with, because we're talking ESG and S of ESG. Yeah.
I think off the top of my head, if I can maybe leave... Okay, let me try to speak a bit louder. I think off the top of my head, if I can leave something in the room, I think that we have a lot more that we have in common than actually what sets us apart. But it will take people, individuals, organizations, sectors, enterprises, etc. We have a lot more in common. And with that in mind, and saying that we have a lot more to gain because we have a lot more in common, it means that let's make a greater effort as individuals, as organizations, as etc., to actually start saying, what can we do collectively to actually create the change? When we say the change, to create the development that we're looking at, and what do we need to coordinate? If it's data, how do we get the agency that we are talking about so that we can lead the change that we really so desperately need? And maybe just one other aspect, because we're talking about the corporate governance of the issue and the S in the ESG, is that maybe private sector can also start considering that there needs to be an element of market development in the CSI space, that the notion of just investing in a project and seeing the project stand needs to also consider that there needs to be some preparation work for that landscape. Meaning, if you're going to a local authority and you want to engage a local authority on whether it's toilets or what, there's an element that needs funding and preparation so that you can leave that investment in the local authority. Why? Because local authorities are being drained of institutional capacities year on year because of the political structure, meaning politicians come and go, and therefore our local authorities have a lot of atrophy. So when I say market development, maybe that's just a challenge that I'd like to leave to private sector, that to consider that as a part of project funding so that you develop the market that you're investing in, because coming and going is not going to cut the grade. So that's all I wanted to say, but thank you very much for this conversation.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed just being on the platform.
Great.
Thank you.
Me too. Final thoughts?
Thanks very much. I think my comment is, I think if you live in the south of Africa, and especially in the southwest of Africa where we are, the S is actually the one that has the most impact on our people as we speak today. So we have, as I said, we're talking about inequality, we're talking about poverty, we're talking about food systems that are absent. But as a society, it's not actually the one that has actually been prioritized. Secondly, I think the conversation today is about the S. It's not about CSI. It's not about charity. It's not about handouts. It is actually about crowding funding into doing things that actually makes a difference and will take us forward. And I think as organization, as I said, we really need to create those platforms where people come together, they collaborate, they talk about regulations, they crowdfund, they create platforms for funding to come in. If you look at the amount of funding that goes into climate globally and also even into Namibia, and you compare to what actually goes to social impact, I think it's only about 1 or 2 or 3, 5% of that. And I think as a society, we need to also, we're not saying that, there should be funding for climate, but we're saying that we should also kind of put effort into increasing collaborated funding for social impact.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. And this is why we wanted to have this conversation, to say, yes, environment is really, really important, but let's not neglect the one, at the expense, let's not focus on the one at the expense of the other. So I hope that with these conversations, we took some notes, and we will be intentional about doing better, incorporating social in our strategies, and to be able to find ways to also to be able to measure it and see how can we measure impact, so instead of just taking pictures. But yeah, I hope this was really fruitful. I certainly, learned a lot from both of you. It was really enriching. So thank you for your time. Thank you for being here. Thank you, audience, for your patience, even when you couldn't hear us well. And thank you for coming. And that's a wrap from us tonight. We'll see you again on the 4th of July, not for American independence, but to talk about 5G. Because July, we're going to focus on AI and cybersecurity and how do we govern that well. So thank you and good night.